Well, today I'm excited because I have with me somebody that I admire. And also, our paths have crossed through a variety of locations, to be honest, especially around this space around encouraging and empowering midlife women. So, Patty Gale is a finance guru, and I'm so excited to have you here. So, Patty, welcome.
Well, thank you, Amy. Thank you so much for having me. It is my absolute pleasure to be here.
Oh, good. I'm so excited to dig into this because if you've listened to any of the podcasts over the past year or follow me at all, finances for me are like, you might even watch this during this video or and listen to it because it may break out into a rash. For me, finances have always been a challenge, not so much because I worry about it, but I don't know if I fully understand.
Mhm.
And being a Gen Xer and having a dad who I remember sitting down, you might be able to relate to this, Patty. My dad was a fastidious man around finances, and he would sit down and he had something called a gray box. I reference it in my book, but he would sit there with this gray box at the end of every month in the dining room, and my mom would pour him a cup of coffee or whatever, and he would sit there and he'd write out all the bills. But my mom never went in, and I never went in. It was like this taboo. Okay, dad is busy
Yeah.
writing out the bills, and I never really had a good concept. So I want to start today by, we're going to cover a variety of topics around finances because it is such a broad area. Let's just start first by just, welcoming you to the listeners and just giving a little glimpse of who you are and why you're so passionate about empowering women, especially at midlife, around finances.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, Amy. So, yeah, very interesting story. My career has absolutely nothing to do with my undergrad degree. So I fell into this industry actually um, by chance, so to speak. And I spent, oh gosh, probably 20 plus years actually in corporate investment management.
Okay.
And so, yeah, so starting way back in the 1980s,
Right.
before we had the internet, before we had social media, all of that. And so I was a securities trader. So I was living in Cincinnati at the time. And so I worked for these small boutique type firms that were independent portfolio management firms, but
Okay.
they managed, large high net worth clientele, municipalities, and
Right.
those types of people. And so I was a securities trader. And so my role was basically when we had changes in a portfolio, which we called asset allocation shifts, my job was to call the, Smith Barneys and the Merrill
Right.
Lynches of the world and actually execute the trades. And, we're talking millions and millions of dollars.
You go, girl. That's awesome. You're a
Right?
numbers girl. I'm loving this already.
And I loved it. It was great. I learned a lot,
Yeah.
obviously. And so I did that from about the mid to late 1980s until about 2003, 2004, because I was a single mom for about 10 of those years.
Wow.
And when I remarried and had my daughter, I just did not want to put her in daycare. And by this point, it was about 2002, 2003. We had the internet now, and I was like, gosh, there's got to be something I can do from home, right? So I did not have to put her in daycare because there were days I would drop my sons off at daycare. And, back then, we didn't have full-time kindergarten,
Right.
right? It was like
Exactly.
mostly half-day kindergarten for these.
Exactly.
There were days
Crazy.
I would literally, right? I would literally sit in my car and cry all the way to work because I had to drop them off somewhere else. And that was really hard. So when she came along, I just didn't want to put her in daycare. And so I turned to the internet and just like, gosh, we were on AOL dial-up at that time. This is the early 2000s.
That noise.
Right?
Yes, exactly. I think Ellen DeGeneres had a show on it, like what millennials wouldn't recognize that sound. Oh yeah, but it's embedded in my
exactly.
brain. I remember that dial-up.
So the short version of that is basically I spent a lot of years in affiliate marketing and digital marketing.
Wow.
And I learned a lot that way, and it was great. I treated my affiliate marketing business kind of like a diversified investment portfolio. So we had, different websites and different topics that would be monetized,
Right.
in those areas. That whole industry is very different now.
Yeah.
And so 2008 came along, and 2008 was obviously an economic crash
Tough year.
and a disaster for a lot of people,
Yep.
our family included. And, that was a really, really hard time for the next several years afterwards, because, when you lose literally everything,
Yeah. Right.
it is embarrassing.
Sure.
You feel a lot of shame.
Mm-hmm.
And for women, I'm sitting here thinking, oh my gosh, I spent all those years in doing investments. Like,
Yes.
I'm supposed to know this stuff, right?
Right.
But corporate investment management and portfolio management is very, very different than personal finance.
Oh, absolutely.
It is like two
Apples and oranges.
industries within the same industry. It's very, very different.
Yeah.
And for me, growing up, I grew up in a family-run business, but I never really learned anything about personal finance. It just was
Right.
not discussed in our house.
We didn't have those classes. We
Mm-mm.
had intro to typewriting. I had
Yep.
that.
Yeah.
And home ec, but we didn't have
Yes.
anything around
No.
finances. You're
Exactly.
right. You're absolutely
Exactly. It was never really, and not to, I'm not placing blame. It's
right.
just that
Exactly.
it just wasn't discussed,
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I personally, after 2008 and several years following, I carried a lot of guilt and a lot of shame. I didn't talk to anybody.
Right.
There were family members that had no idea what was going on.
Right.
And it was really, really hard. And so finally, I was like this volcano, that was brewing for years,
Yeah.
like going to erupt if I didn't talk to somebody.
Yeah.
And so I actually started confiding into some very, very close, trusted girlfriends.
Right. Power of
And
friends. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And when I started talking to them
Mm-hmm.
about what I was feeling and what we had gone through, oh my gosh, Amy, it was like,
Wow.
it was a light bulb moment for me, because they started exhaling and started talking to me about the same things that they were going through.
I believe
very, very similar. Right. And it was like, oh my gosh, like, okay, so
Wow.
why are
They can-
women
yeah.
talking about this?
Yeah. Right.
Because traditionally in this industry, there are a lot of financial quote unquote gurus and experts out there that will be like, well, if you don't have this, then you handled your money wrong. Or
Right.
if you don't have X amount of dollars, then you didn't do this right. And that from the industry places a lot of shame.
Oh yeah.
And then when
Absolutely.
right. And then when you experience those yourself, you're thinking, oh my gosh, what did I do wrong?
Yeah.
And that was really, really hard. But when I started talking with my close girlfriends, and, the education status was irrelevant.
Yeah.
The economic status was irrelevant. We're talking
irrelevant.
girlfriends with master's degrees and PhDs. And,
Exactly.
it was like, oh my gosh. So I knew if my close circle of girlfriends
Right.
were experiencing and feeling these same things, there had to be hundreds, if not thousands of other
Absolutely.
women in this age group who were
Yes.
feeling and experiencing the same thing.
I love that. Well, and I think there's so much truth around that, because when you do start challenging that dialogue and kind of having those courageous conversations, women feel supported and you feel trusting. You feel that there's this community that is built.
Yes.
And I especially find with Gen Xers, and I'm not just labeling Gen Xers because I know, other generations as well, but I do feel that, I don't fully think we understood the value of money and really how that all translated, to growing up. So I would love to just dig into, first of all, just starting by, what's the biggest fear you really see that holds women back?
Sure. So the biggest fear that holds women back is finding someone they can trust. Finding someone who will not talk over them, because this industry has like its own language, right?
Yeah, right.
And so finding someone that they can trust, it's a very masculine industry.
It is. I think it always has been. Yeah.
It is. It was built for men.
Right.
And it's a very masculine industry. The language is very, very different. And for a lot of women who were not, brought up in a financially empowering environment, it can be very intimidating.
Yeah.
And it can be very scary. And women want to know, for a lot of women, it's not so much about building wealth for wealth's sake. It's about, am I going to be okay? Am I not going to be a bag lady? Am I not going to have to depend on I want to make sure that, I'm not going to have to depend on the government or family or
Right.
friends or anybody
Right.
else when I'm 85 and 90 years old.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's so true.
Yeah.
So let's dig into a couple of these issues. And of
Mhm.
course, I always poll my community before. This was one of the topics that was always top of heart for and top of mind for many people. I had one woman ask me, and she's actually from Idaho. She said, how do I really establish savings for myself? She's been married. She said she was married for 30 years. And, she's trying to establish some financial security for herself. What would be your advice on kind of first steps and strategizing around that?
Sure. No, that's a really great question.
Yeah.
And that really brings in the foundational part.
Mm,
And so in financial planning, we talk about your foundations, and your
right.
foundations are knowing where you stand first. So that's creating a net worth statement, a cash flow statement, because if you don't know where you are now,
Right.
you won't be able to chart a path for where you want to go. So
Exactly.
those are the two core elements, is creating what we call a statement of financial position. And all that is your assets versus your liabilities, what
Okay.
you own versus what you owe.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very simple. Doesn't have to be super complicated.
Right.
And then the other piece to that is your cash flow statement. And your cash flow statement is money coming in versus money going out every
Mm-hmm.
single month. So once you know those two pieces, then you can start to look for what we call money leaks,
Mm.
right? Like, are there subscriptions you forgot about
Mm.
that you can cancel that
Right.
can create more positive cash flow for you?
Good
Things
point.
like that. There's a lot more details involved when we talk about,
Right.
analyzing different things, but those are the basics of the foundations of where to start. And then you can say, okay, now I know what's coming in and going out. What do I want as a goal to start saving?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So
Mm-hmm.
you always want to start with that. You always want to start with your emergency fund.
Mm.
That is your very first piece of the savings. And kind of a disturbing trend that we're seeing now in this time is lack of emergency funds.
Right. Right.
Yeah, which is really, it's hard, but
That's so interesting. You mentioned
mm,
that because, there was a time in my life when I lived in Germany. And during that time, my family was all in the States. And I lost both of my parents during that time.
oh
And
wow.
I had to get from Frankfurt, Germany to the States, to
Mhm.
Wisconsin. And of course, on a moment's notice. And that is something that I'm very lucky to have a husband who talks about money and makes it makes sense to me. He breaks it down for me. He knows me well enough that when it's too much, but we had to have that emergency fund there, and that's not
Mhm.
easy to have. And I do think
No.
at these times right now, it's a struggle. And so what do you advise around, is that an emergency fund that you just you literally have a cup somewhere and you put money in it all the time in your coin jar, or is this like a fund that you set up that this is specific for that?
Mhm. Sure. So yeah, that's a great question. So your emergency fund, you can start with a coin jar. I mean, if you
Exactly.
don't, you can start
You
as
never know
simple
how
as
much you're
that,
going to get in those coin
right?
jars.
Exactly. You can start with a coin jar. When you're looking at your cash flow, especially, you can say, okay, um, and keep in mind too, an emergency fund is always going to be ebbing. It's like an ebb and flow. It's
Yes.
always going to it's like a living, breathing, moving thing. It's
Right.
never always going to be a fixed dollar amount, but you want to start with, like, okay, what is the most important thing?
Mm-hmm.
If I lose my job,
Mm-hmm.
you have to figure out what is the most essential pieces to keep the roof over your head and food on
Right.
the table and the lights on in the house.
Right.
But if you're in a situation where that's not an issue, okay, well, what about when the car breaks down,
Right.
or if you own your home, if the water heater, those are emergency things.
Right.
Taking a vacation may seem like an emergency right now, but it's not an
But it's
emergency.
not. Okay. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Exactly. So that's a separate fund. That's like a fund.
Right. That's a fun
Okay.
fund.
Yep. Yep. Okay.
Exactly. So like for your emergency fund, what you'll want to do is you want to keep it in we call it a liquid asset, which is
Mm-hmm.
a cash or cash equivalent. that's easily accessible, right?
Right.
Because if your car breaks down, depending on what's going on with your insurance policy, for your car or your car itself, if it may still be under warranty, which is great, but if it's not, then you need to be able to access those funds easily. So the first place would be to look at your, where do you bank right now?
Right.
Does your bank offer a free checking account? I mean, you don't want to be paying, to hold that account there.
Exactly.
Or if you have a local credit union, most credit union accounts are free.
Good point.
Really.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, many of them are free.
Advice.
So if you have a local credit union, that would be another great place to establish a credit union checking account.
Interesting. That's great advice. One question we get a lot, or I get a lot, and I know we talked about this. Gosh, Patty, it's probably been at least a month when we kind of talked about this conversation, is where we are in our life right now is very different as far as retirement savings. And I think that's different because we're investing more in our kids' educations. I mean, I grew up in Wisconsin. You stayed in the Wisconsin state area. You went to school in that state. I mean, that was just kind of how it was. And now, families are incurring tremendous expenses around education, and they don't have that retirement fund that they thought they may have. They're pulling from their 401ks or things like that. What advice do you have for families right now around that when their retirement is really evolving?
That's a really great question. And because we're dealing with midlife and midlife women, and we're talking about, I know you two are part of this movement about reinventing midlife and what that means.
Right.
And so when we talk about reinventing midlife, we also have to talk about reinventing what retirement looks like or what the finances behind that look like, because this whole idea of retirement at age 65 is actually a 140-year-old idea.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
It was actually invented. It was this made up idea. Yes. Oh. In Germany, not the United States. It was invented in Germany in about 1880, late 1800s. They needed a way to bring, because I guess from what I've read, and I've done some research on this, the youth unemployment rate was really high. And so at that time, you had a lot of farming and industrialization, right? So in order to take care of the older generation and allow for younger people to come into that workforce, this idea of taking care of the older people was really invented. And at that time, the average age expectancy for males at that time was about 65 years old. Sure. So here we are in 2020, 140 years later, and we're still have this idea of retirement at 65. But the reality, though, Amy, is that we, and especially as women, we are going to live so much longer. I mean, we're living until our 80s or 90s. I'm Italian. So, my great-grandparents and grandparents lived well into their 90s. Amazing. And so you think about, okay, if you retire, quote unquote, traditionally retire at 65, what are you going to do for the next 30 years?
Exactly.
So we have to really look at, this idea of changing the narrative about what retirement means. And I am starting to see, and, in some of my networking, people who are actually doing this, because the reality is, and especially for women, and the times that we're living in now, many of us are not going to have that huge bucket of $1 million plus, $2 million plus, or whatever by the time we're 65. Right. Social Security age right now, actually full Social Security retirement age is actually 67, not 65 anymore. Interesting. So we have to start being more open to the idea of, okay, well, what can I do that I love that doesn't put me in a financial, bad situation, but allows me to still use my gifts and talents and earn an income and do something that I love until I decide when it's time to stop, but still be financially self-supporting. So it's really about defining what this means on your terms, not what the typical industry narrative means. And, finding fulfillment in that regard. There are so many more opportunities that we have now than we didn't have 30 years ago because we have the internet.
Exactly. Exactly. And that power of reinvention. I mean, there are so many women that are taking that journey now. They're taking
Yes.
that, they're being empowered by others. They're having these conversations. They're saying, okay, I can do this for the next 10, 15 years.
Yes.
And so let's talk about that question that so many women have, which is really the asking for money, or saying, we're such givers. Women are givers in general. They volunteer for committees. They do a million things for other people. But when it comes to them, it's very difficult to say,
Yeah.
okay, well, my time is worth this, and when you're launching a business, or you're whatever it is, if you're an artist and you're painting pictures and all of a sudden you want to sell them, how do you go about that question of finding value and saying, what, I think I'm worth this, so I think I should be paid this? Do you have any hints around that?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a mindset question.
Mm.
That's really all about mindset. And
Yeah.
I went through a lot of that myself too. When I first I really went through this whole reinvention process myself. I left digital marketing,
Right.
pursued financial planning and, coaching and all that, but from a different perspective than traditional. And so you have to think about it like, you know what? Okay, I've raised my family, or my youngest is maybe in high school. They aren't as dependent upon me now as they were 20
Right.
years ago. And
Right.
it's your turn now. It is your turn to own your power
Yes.
and to own your value.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that comes from, I think, and I went through this too. So believe me, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
We get so entrenched,
Yes.
and we were so entrenched. I mean, my oldest is 36. My youngest is now going to be 20 in a couple of months, right? So I've been raising kids for 36 years.
Wow.
I get it. And thank
Well
you.
done. I know. Isn't it crazy when you actually break that down and you think,
Yes.
I've been raising kids for 30 years,
Yeah.
or 25 years.
Right. And I think back to like when, before I got married the first time and before I had kids, it was like, I was actually on Madison Avenue in New York City working for a big advertising agency, right? I had these, it's kind of like you have to peel the layers off one at a time.
Right.
And rediscover who you were back then and apply it to who you are now. And that's where you're really gaining back your power and gaining back your confidence.
I love that. I talk about it all the time. I call it a highlight reel. That's what I do.
Yes, absolutely.
Everything translates. All of those things, those are your superpowers.
Yes,
I love that.
absolutely.
And you did that, Patty, because you really took on that challenge of becoming a novice again, as far as learning something new, similar industry, but a whole different facet of that. So you put on your cape and said, all right, I'm going to learn this. And now you're empowering women all over the country and the world around that, which is so fabulous. And I think that is the tough thing for women to figure out their value, who they are from a value perspective.
Right. And the thing I want to add too is allow it to happen organically. I mean, this wasn't like one day I decided to, okay, I'm going to do this now. It was a process.
Yes.
It was an absolute process for me because I had to shed all of those other things that previously defined me to defining who I wanted to be now and going forward. Because now this is for me and for all the women I'm meant to serve. And, every woman, I believe, especially when we get to this point in midlife, you have gifts and talents that are there.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of uncovering them to realize what they are again and be able to, create that in an embodiment for the women you're meant to serve. If I had not gone through, as hard as that was, Amy, and let me tell you, it was awful. It was the darkest period of my life. But going through that would not have, if I had not gone through that, I wouldn't be here. We would not be having this conversation.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. That was putting your fear aside. That was going to those friends, which I think so many times as women, we just think, oh, we got this. We can handle it. And you feel weak if you try to use, your resources. And that's what we talk about all the time, because we share this space around women. at this age. It's like, use
Mhm.
those resources, use those trusted
Yeah,
confidants that you have in your life, because they are going to challenge you. You've got blind spots.
absolutely.
We all do. And so, especially around finances,
Mhm.
have those conversations with someone you really trust, because it's amazing where that goes. And I think,
Exactly.
as you having a daughter who, is 20, I have a daughter who's 23, they're seeing this, and
Mhm.
they're seeing, their moms now challenging themselves in different ways, and they view them in a different lens, and it's
Yeah.
powerful, especially when you're talking about something like finances,
Mhm.
because these young adults are navigating this right now.
Yes.
It's a whole nother topic we'll talk about on another episode. We'll dig more
Awesome.
into young adults
Mhm.
and how they're handling all of this,
Yeah.
filing for unemployment and this whole furlough thing. We're going to have a conversation about that. So Patty will be back. But I do find you just inspiring around the fact that you were brave and courageous, and it's your story, and that makes you so much more powerful and passionate about what you do. So I thank
Thank
you for,
you.
for doing that.
Well, thank
Um,
you. And I really owe the credit to those girlfriends because
yeah,
they are truly the ones who said, you need to do this.
right, right,
You need to, you know, tell, not just tell the story, but,
right.
actually figure out a way to make it different
Yes.
than what it's traditionally been for women so they can have that financial empowerment,
Mhm.
unto themselves. So I really owe a lot of that to them.
Amazing. And we both use this tag fearless, fearlessly,
Yes.
and I love that, because it is about being brave. And Patty, you work with women all over the place, right? It's
Mhm.
it's well, now
Yeah.
we're living in a virtual environment. So if
Mhm.
somebody's listening and is saying, you know what, boy, I have some questions that I think Patty can really help guide me. Um, how does that process work? I'll attach everything to the episode notes, so there'll be
Sure.
a website and a contact. But what can they expect from that first initial conversation with you? What should they have
Sure.
prepared? How should they take that on?
Sure. So the first thing they'll want to do is I actually have a midlife money guide for women,
Great.
which is probably the first thing they want to look at because that is, 6 actionable things that they can do right
Yes.
now, like what we were talking about before,
Right.
which is like the statement of financial position, the cash flow statement, knowing their money story,
Okay.
because mindset,
Mm.
there's so much more to this than just the mechanics of money, and
Yes.
that's where I come in and we talk about the mindset and money stories and the emotions of everything and combine that with, the mechanics of money as well. So
Fabulous.
that's where they really want to start,
Great.
in looking at that because we also talk about, estate planning and protecting your legacy and things
Mm-hmm.
like that.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I'm working on, if they want to work with me one-on-one, what they'll do is they'll go to the website and they'll be able to, we'll have a, 15, 20-minute conversation
Great.
to see if they're a good fit for that. If
Yeah.
not, that's totally okay.
Mm-hmm.
We're working on, and I can't reveal too many details yet, although
Nope,
I would
that's
love to.
okay. Yeah.
We're actually working on a way to incorporate all of this in a way that's much more affordable for women,
Great.
because traditionally financial planning to hire me one-on-one is one thing, but not everybody may be ready for that.
Right.
So we're working on something else that's
Awesome.
going to allow those women
More
to be
options.
still able to have those same fundamentals and same
Right.
access,
Right.
just in a much more affordable way.
That's
Um,
fantastic. I'd
so,
like to have you back too, Patty, to talk about maybe more of a roundtable discussion and bring some
mhm.
women on that might have some questions for you, and kind of
Sure.
broach it from that direction as well,
Yeah, I'd love that.
because you do have value to add, and I love sharing that. So
Oh,
thank
thank
you for that.
you.
One question I ask, and I know Patty has probably given some thought to this, but I just shared this in an episode about what advice you'd give your younger self. That's the question I always
Mhm.
ask, and there's always commonalities, but no two answers are ever the same.
Right.
So I'm so anxious to hear what you have to say. So Patty, if you were sitting on the couch and you look over and there's 30-year-old Patty,
Oh my
um,
gosh.
I know, isn't it? And I immediately visualized 30-year-old Amy. I just had my second child. I go right there in my mind. What advice would you give
Sure.
Patty?
So the 30-year-old Patty was a single mom of
Mm.
2 little boys. They were 6 and 4. So if I were sitting on the couch with her today, I would tell her to never give her financial power away.
Mm.
There is there is no law, there's no statement, there's no spiritual or secular anything that says you have to combine finances with someone else. And if you do, that's great. Just make sure you're both on the same page.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But always make sure you have your own, and never give your financial empowerment away, because that is your security. That is your safety. That is also your emotional safety.
Yeah.
And in doing that, and seek out those trusted girlfriends and professionals, and allow yourself to know that you don't have to do this all by yourself.
Exactly. Exactly. Wow. That's a goosebump one. I love that. Thank you for that, Patty. Thanks so much for spending time with me, and just being a part of this community, and so valuable. And I know you share your advice everywhere, so people will be able to find you, and I'll link it to the episode notes. But I thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Amy. This has been an absolute pleasure, and I appreciate you having me. And I hope there are women out there that find this absolutely helpful for their journey as well.
Absolutely. We'll be in touch.
Sounds awesome.
Thanks so much for tuning in the episode today. You know what? I love to engage with my community. There's nothing better than linking arms and furthering the conversations. If you haven't left a review yet, and you're finding the content of the podcast engaging and inspiring you in some way, if you haven't yet, leave a podcast review on Apple. And go ahead and follow me on socials. I'm everywhere, man. Instagram, amy.k.schmidt. You can follow me there. And on Facebook, I have a page called Fearlessly Facing 50. 50 is spelled out. As well as a great group that launched a few months ago. It's interactive, engaging, and it's all like-minded people that are linking arms and cheering each other on through challenges and through celebrations. Check it out on Facebook. It's called Cannonball, Make Your Splash with Confidence. And if you're a Twitter person, now I don't tweet much, to be honest, but Amy Facing 50, I'm there on Twitter as well. So like I always say, go forth and be awesome. Love yourself. And reach out to someone who really could use a little love this week. Be in touch soon.